Welcome to the deep dive. We're really thrilled you're joining us today because the topic we're exploring is honestly, it's absolutely monumental.
It really is. We're looking at the very essence of Japanese civilization today.
Right. And normally, when you look at the history of a nation, you get a timeline. You get a list of dynasties, a catalog of wars, maybe a map of shifting borders.
Yeah, the standard textbook approach.
Exactly. But today, we're taking a completely different approach. We are looking at Japan not just as a static place on a map, but as an ongoing epistemological and cultural project.
Because the fundamental question we're exploring isn't just, what happened in Japan. It's rather what is Japan. And historically, that has been an incredibly complex question to answer.
So to answer it, we are basing our analysis today on a really comprehensive synthesis titled A Survey of Japanese Civilization by Artchell C. Dog.
Yeah, and this work is basically a masterclass in historical synthesis. It draws on some heavyweight scholarly works, things like the Cambridge History of Japan, Craig G. Benjamin's Foundations of Eastern Civilization, and A History of Asia by Murphy and Stapleton.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because the central premise here, the really fascinating hook, is that Japan's ultimate superpower as a civilization isn't a specific religious creed or some permanent territorial empire.
Right.
Its superpower is this incredible habit of reception and conversion. It's this constant vibrating tension between what the sources call borrowed form and native essence.
And we're going to explore exactly how Japan acts as the ultimate master of this selective cultural reception. They bring in foreign ideas from Tang Dynasty China to Prussian militarism to American democracy.
And they digest them, right, slowly and deliberately to produce something that is uniquely, undeniably Japanese.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, to understand how a civilization achieves that level of adaptable resilience, we really have to look at the structural recurrences that just echo throughout its history.
The patterns that keep popping up.
Yeah, the architectural patterns. We'll be mapping these out as we trace the timeline today. We are looking at four main pillars. First, the dual structure of authority. Second, the consistent gap between formal social ordering and lived reality.
And then the aesthetic of impermanence, right?
Right. These pillars basically provide the framework for how a nation can completely rewrite its cultural and political operating system multiple times.
Without losing its core identity. It's wild. But really quick, just to set the stage for you, the listener, as we dive in here, because our source text covers some incredibly turbulent eras.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about imperial expansion, the rapid state building of the Meiji period, the absolute devastation of the Second World War, and the post-war political dominance.
Very politically charged history.
Yeah, very. So our goal today isn't to litigate the morality of these historical events. We're not taking sides. We are here to coldly examine the architectural patterns of the state exactly as the author lays them out.
Right. We're looking at how the machine was built, how it broke, and how it was reassembled. We're maintaining complete objectivity regarding the political and ideological realities of those eras.
Because mapping the architecture of a civilization requires looking at all the foundational stones, even the most blood-soaked or controversial ones, with a clear, analytical eye.
So we can actually understand the mechanics of that selective cultural reception.
Exactly. So let's look at the very foundation of this entire project, the physical ground itself. The geography.
The geography is everything here.
Because the Tsushima Strait acted as this volatile moat. Japan is one of the very few civilizations that treated continental culture as an opt-in subscription rather than a mandatory conquest.
That's a great way to put it. It's an archipelago situated just close enough to the Asian mainland that ideas, technologies, and texts could cross the water.
But separated by seas treacherous enough to make massive, sustained military invasion nearly impossible.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer geopolitical luxury that geography provided. If you look at the Asian mainland or the European continent, for that matter.
Yeah, there's a lot of flat land.
Right, and cultural transmission often happened at the point of a sword. A conquering army rolls in, dismantles the local power structures, and imposes their own administrative codes, their language, their religion upon the conquered people.
You don't get a choice.
You don't.
Yeah.
But the sea acted as a civilizational filter for Japan. China, or later Western powers, could broadcast their civilization, but they couldn't easily send armies to enforce it.
And the ultimate dramatic example of this from the text is the Mongol invasions.
Oh, this is such a wild historical moment.
In 1274 and 1281, the Mongols, who had successfully conquered practically every other landmass they set their sights on, creating the largest contiguous land empire in human history.
The apex predators of the 13th century.
Exactly. They send massive invasion fleets toward Kyushu, and they get repelled. The first time, it was a combination of fierce Japanese resistance and a sudden storm.
And then the second time, in 1281, an absolutely massive armada was just decimated by devastating typhoons.
The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, right? The divine winds.
Yeah, divine winds. And the psychological impact of that, it just cannot be overstated. When the greatest military machine the world had ever seen is literally swallowed by the sea just off your shores, it breeds a profound sense of insular security.
It's like the gods themselves are protecting your borders.
Precisely. Because of this geographic and meteorological protection, Japan had this incredible luxury. They could undergo prolonged selective cultural importation from a position of absolute physical safety.
They could choose what to receive from the mainland, at what pace they wanted it, and in what specific form.
Right, it wasn't forced on them.
I love to think of it like this. Imagine having a one-way mirror looking into a highly advanced neighboring society. You can watch them, you can take meticulous notes, you can copy their homework.
But they can never break through the glass and force you to abide by their rules.
It's the ultimate civilizational life hack, but I think a lot of people might assume that before Japan started looking through that mirror at the Korean Peninsula and China, they were just kind of a blank slate.
Oh, not at all.
Yeah, the text is very clear that Japanese culture didn't start with Chinese imports. It started with a profoundly robust indigenous foundation.
And the archaeological record provides a brilliant picture of this. The text details the earliest inhabitants whose descendants produced the Jomon culture.
Jomon, right.
Yeah, we are talking about anatomically modern humans who had been on the islands for tens of thousands of years, long before the land bridges to the continent were severed by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age.
But they've been there forever, basically.
Basically. The Jomon were primarily hunter-gatherers, but they were incredibly sophisticated, far beyond what we typically associate with that term.
They weren't just wandering around struggling to survive.
No, they established permanent settlements, built complex pit house villages, and actively managed forest resources.
And they made some of the oldest pottery yet discovered in human history, didn't they?
They did. These beautiful, elaborate rope cord patterned ceramics, which is actually what the word Jomon means, cord marked.
Oh, that makes sense.
They also crafted these highly expressive, almost alien-looking clay figurines called dogu, which suggest complex spiritual or ritualistic practices.
So you have this remarkably stable, complex society thriving in relative isolation for literally millennia.
Right. And then comes the first major encounter with continental civilization, the Yayoi transformation.
This is around the first millennium BCE, right?
Yeah, it starts gaining momentum then. Migrants from the Korean Peninsula arrive, and they aren't just bringing new pottery styles. They are bringing the heavy artillery of early civilization.
The big tech upgrades.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bronze technology, ironworking, and most importantly, wet rice cultivation.
And wet rice agriculture isn't just, a new item on the menu. The text emphasizes that it is a complete structural revolution for a society.
It absolutely is. And this raises an important question about how societies organize themselves. Wet rice agriculture requires massive, coordinated collective labor.
Because of the paddies and the water.
Yes, you have to build paddies, manage complex irrigation systems, coordinate planting and harvesting cycles. You cannot do this as an isolated family unit. It requires a tightly bound community structure.
A whole village working together.
And furthermore, rice produces a storable surplus of calories. Once you have storable surplus food, you inevitably get social stratification.
Because someone has to guard the grain.
Right. You suddenly have elites who control the granaries, which means you have wealth disparities, which leads directly to territorial competition and the militarization of those communities to protect their resources.
So the arrival of rice essentially boots up the political software of early Japan. But what I find so compelling here is how the text highlights the archaeological evidence from this transition period.
The mix of artifacts.
Yeah. You look at the dig sites, and you find bronze mirrors and iron weapons of distinctly continental character buried right alongside pottery that still bears the traditional ancient Jomon traces.
It wasn't an erasure.
Exactly. Right from the very earliest layers of Japanese history, we see this pattern absorption alongside retention. They don't just erase the native hunter-gatherer culture to replace it with the imported agricultural one. They layer them.
The indigenous foundation absorbs the continental tech,
Right.
which perfectly sets the stage for the first truly massive wave of deliberate cultural borrowing.
Epoch 1, as we're calling it.
Yes. By the 6th century CE, the scattered agricultural communities had largely been consolidated under the hegemony of the Yamato state in central Japan.
The Yamato kings.
Right. And they realized that to compete, to manage a growing state, they needed a more robust administrative operating system. So they looked across the water to the Sui and later the Tang dynasties in China.
Which were arguably the most advanced civilizations on the planet at the time.
Well, without a doubt.
So this is where we see Japan essentially downloading a completely foreign, hyper-advanced operating system. They didn't just bring over a few agricultural tools this time. They brought over a complete civilizational package, Buddhism, and the Chinese script.
And when Buddhism arrived via the Korean kingdom of Baekje in 552 CE or 538, depending on the historical dating you prefer, it wasn't just a new set of metaphysical beliefs.
It was a Trojan horse of culture.
A vector for a massive influx of continental culture. It carried an entire administrative, technological, and architectural world with it.
Just think about the logistics. To read Buddhist sutras, you needed monks who knew how to read Chinese.
Exactly. And to build the massive wooden Buddhist temples, you needed continental architects, highly skilled carpenters, bronze casters for the statues, tile makers for the roofs.
You had to import the whole supply chain.
Adopting the religion meant importing the entire industrial and intellectual apparatus that supported it.
And think about the sheer audacity of adopting the Chinese script. The text points out that the spoken Japanese language is grammatically, syntactically, and phonetically unlike Chinese in almost every single respect.
They are completely unrelated language families.
Yeah, Chinese is a tonal language, largely isolating with no verb conjugations. Japanese is polysyllabic, heavily agglutinative, with complex verb inflections and particles. It's a total mismatch.
It's like trying to use a blueprint for a bicycle to build a nuclear submarine.
That is a perfect analogy. But they did it anyway, wholesale. They took tens of thousands of complex Chinese logograms and forced them to represent Japanese sounds and concepts.
It was a monumental intellectual undertaking. They adopted the script, the religion, and very quickly the administrative philosophy.
Like Prince Shotoku.
Yes, in the late 6th and early 7th centuries, figures like Prince Shotoku actively reorganized the Yamato court. He drafts a 17-article constitution, which isn't a constitution in the modern legal sense.
More like a moral guideline.
Exactly, a set of moral and political principles, heavily based on Buddhist and Confucian ideals of harmony and centralized authority.
The Yamato court was all in. They started sending these massive study missions, the Kentoshi, across the dangerous ocean to the Sui and Tang courts in China.
Fleets of ships carrying hundreds of monks, scholars, artists, and officials.
Just sent to soak up everything they could. And this culminates in the Taika reforms of 646 CE and the Taiho Code of 702 CE.
Massive legislative events.
Massive top-down attempts to literally rebuild the Japanese state according to Tang administrative principles. They wanted the whole package: centralized bureaucratic governance, the abolition of private land ownership in favor of state-owned land distributed to peasants, standardized taxation, and a merit-based civil service.
But here is where the tension between borrowed form and native essence really flexes its muscles.
The rubber hits the road.
Exactly. The text points out that this attempt to just copy-paste Tang China's government onto Japan was fundamentally flawed because of the environmental and social realities we discussed earlier.
The geography gets in the way again.
It does. China's massive, flat, alluvial plains made uniform, centralized administration mathematically possible. Japan, however, is a rugged, highly mountainous archipelago fractured into isolated river valleys.
You simply cannot slap a centralized bureaucratic grid over that kind of topography given the communication technology of the 8th century.
It just doesn't work. And that's not even mentioning the human element. The native aristocratic clans, the Uji, were way too powerful and deeply embedded in the social fabric to just be legislated out of existence by some new Chinese-style legal code.
Right. The Uji had deep hereditary roots tied to local lands and specific Shinto deities, or kami.
So what emerged was that characteristic Japanese compromise. They adopted the Chinese bureaucratic vocabulary, they created ministries of this and departments of that, but the social reality remained inherently Japanese.
The system was quickly dominated by competing aristocratic houses who simply figured out how to inhabit the new administrative titles while maintaining their hereditary privileges.
They even built a spectacular capital city, Nara, explicitly modeled on the grid layout of the Tang capital of Chang'an.
Complete with the massive Todaiji temple housing a colossal bronze Buddha.
It was Japan performing continental civilization on a grand scale.
But then a massive pivot happens. By 894 CE, the official state missions to Tang China simply ceased.
They pulled the plug.
Yeah. The Tang dynasty was slowly collapsing into rebellion and disorder, and the Japanese court basically decided, okay, the server is down. There is nothing left for us to download from them right now.
And the capital had recently moved to Heian-kyo, which we now know as Kyoto.
Right, and severing that official continental umbilical cord kicked off the first great epoch of our story, a period of massive, intense internal cultural consolidation.
The motivation for this epic wasn't just isolationism, though. It was identity formation. For centuries, the Japanese elite had been straining under the exhausting pressure of constantly updating their cultural software to match the Chinese gold standard.
Keeping up with the Joneses, essentially.
Exactly. And when that pressure was removed, the Heian court turned inward. This is the era when, as the text beautifully puts it, Japan began to dream in its own language.
I love that phrase. And the ultimate undeniable symbol of this is what they did with that mismatched Chinese writing system.
The invention of kana.
Yes. During the Heian period, the Japanese took a step back and realized that using complex Chinese characters to write out every single phonetic syllable of Japanese grammar was incredibly cumbersome.
It was exhausting to write.
So they invented the kana script. They took specific, simplified Chinese characters and turned them into a purely phonetic, syllabic alphabet designed specifically to accommodate the nuances of Japanese grammar, verb endings, and particles.
A brilliant adaptation.
They integrated the borrowed Chinese characters, the kanji for the root meaning of words, with their own invented kana for the grammatical connective tissue. It is a permanent adaptation of a borrowed form to serve a native essence.
Which gave birth to one of the most remarkable literary explosions in world history.
Because they finally had a script that flowed with the natural rhythm of their own spoken language.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And because of this, the aristocratic women of the Heian court, who were largely excluded from writing in official scholarly Chinese, began producing astonishing literature.
The pinnacle of this being, of course, the Tale of Genji.
Written by a lady-in-waiting named Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century.
It's often called the world's first novel, but even that kind of undersells it, right?
Oh, it completely undersells it. It's not just an early novel. It is a sprawling, multi-generational masterpiece of psychological depth, intricate social observation, and profound aesthetic intelligence.
This is huge.
And crucially, it articulates a philosophical concept that becomes the bedrock of Japanese identity, mono-aware, or the pathos of things.
Mono-no-aware.
It's this deep, bittersweet, emotional recognition that the beauty of the world is entirely inseparable from its transience. The cherry blossoms are beautiful because they will fall in a few days. Love affairs are intense because they will inevitably end.
This refined, highly cultivated sensibility that was entirely Japanese, expressed using linguistic tools that originally came from the continent, but fundamentally transformed.
Right. Now, here's the irony of the whole Heian period.
Okay.
While the aristocratic court in Heian was busy writing sublime poetry, matching incense, and inventing the psychological novel,
they were simultaneously, almost willfully, losing actual political control over the country.
Yes. And this brings us to the first of the major structural recurrences the text identifies, the dual structure of authority.
This is such a crucial pattern.
It's absolutely vital to understanding how Japan functions politically. During the Heian period, the emperor was elevated to a position of sacred, almost untouchable remove from actual governance.
His legitimacy was absolute.
Supposedly derived from unbroken descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. He was the high priest of the realm, responsible for ensuring the cosmos remained in balance through continuous ritual.
But the actual practical power, the administration, the taxation, the political maneuvering was monopolized by the Fujiwara clan.
The Fujiwara were political geniuses. They mastered this system known as marriage politics.
How did that work exactly?
They would marry their daughters into the imperial line, ensure those daughters gave birth to a male heir, and then pressure the sitting emperor to abdicate in favor of this child.
And the child emperor would then need a regent to rule on his behalf.
And surprise, the regent would be the boy's maternal grandfather, the head of the Fujiwara clan.
It's a brilliant loophole. So you have a consistent institutionalized separation. The holder of sacred legitimacy is completely distinct from the holder of effective power.
What's crucial to analyze here is why this dual structure proved so incredibly resilient over the centuries.
Why it didn't just collapse.
Right. Think about the nature of absolute monarchy in other civilizations. If the king makes all the practical, everyday political decisions, if he declares the wars, levies the taxes, and passes the laws.
And he also represents the sacred center of the universe.
Exactly. What happens when he inevitably makes a catastrophic mistake?
Right. If a king starves his people through bad policy, and the people rise up and cut his head off, the whole civilizational structure can collapse because the sacred order has been violently broken.
The mandate of heaven is lost.
But in Japan's dual structure, you can overthrow the practical ruler. You can depose the Fujiwara regents, or later the shoguns, without destroying the universe's symbolic order.
Because the emperor is safely insulated from the messy, unpopular realities of governance.
The sacred center remains untouched, allowing the practical administration to be swapped out without triggering a civilizational collapse.
This raises an important question, though.
What's that?
How does a society function when the people ostensibly in charge, the refined poetry-writing court nobles in Kyoto and the Fujiwara regions, aren't actually the ones doing the governing, the taxing, the living, and the dying out in the rugged provinces?
Well, nature abhors a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
Because the central court in Kyoto essentially withdrew from practical, hands-on governance to focus entirely on courtly aesthetics and ritual, the provinces had to fend for themselves.
The central government stopped maintaining a national conscript army.
So the provincial landholders who are managing these massive tax-exempt private estates called shun, they had to hire their own muscle to protect their borders and enforce local laws.
And this leads directly to the rise of the warrior class.
The samurai.
Yes, and fundamentally shifts the trajectory of Japanese history. And importantly, this rising warrior class had no continental precedent.
Really? None at all.
Think about it. If you look at China's Confucian ideal, governance was supposed to be executed by highly educated civilian bureaucrats who passed rigorous literary examinations. They had no ideological place for a hereditary military aristocracy.
Ah, right. The scholars were in charge, not the generals.
Exactly. So the Japanese warriors, or bushi, developed their own unique corporate identity, their own localized power networks, and their own austere ethics, what we'd later call bushido, entirely outside the frameworks provided by continental civilization.
And from there, we see centuries of escalating military rule. It starts with the Kamakura shogunate in the late 12th century, established by Minamoto Yoritomo after a brutal civil war known as the Genpei War.
Yoritomo is brilliant because he doesn't try to overthrow the emperor.
Right, he utilizes the dual structure perfectly.
Yeah.
He gets the emperor in Kyoto to name him Sei Taishogun, the great general who subdues the barbarian.
He gets the sacred stamp of approval.
But he sets up his military government hundreds of miles away in Kamakura. Kyoto handles the rituals, Kamakura handles the swords.
And this dual structure operates functionally for a while, giving way to the Ashikaga shogunate, which eventually loses its grip and fractures into a full century of relentless, brutal civil war.
The Sengoku period.
The Warring States period, yeah. It was an era of profound social upheaval, where lower-ranking vassals routinely overthrew their lords in a phenomenon known as Gakokujo, the low oppressing the high.
It's from the ashes of that century of chaotic warfare that three great unifiers emerge in the late 16th century, right? Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Between roughly 1560 and 1615, they execute an era of extraordinary violence, but also profound institutional creativity.
Like Hideyoshi's land surveys.
Yes, Hideyoshi conducts massive nationwide land surveys to assess tax yields, and he literally disarms the peasantry through sword hunts. He decrees that only the samurai class can bear arms,
Creating a sharp institutional separation between warriors and farmers that hadn't existed before.
which perfectly sets the stage for our analysis of the Tokugawa era, which we can call the Tokugawa paradox.
The Tokugawa paradox. I like that.
In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu wins the decisive battle of Sekigahara. He unifies Japan and establishes a system that will enforce unprecedented peace and stability for 2.5 centuries.
The Bakuhan system.
It's a complex dual arrangement where the Tokugawa shogunate of the Bakufu exercises supreme national authority from their capital in Edo.
Which is modern-day Tokyo.
Right. But roughly 300 regional domain lords, the daimyo, govern their local territories, or han.
But the Tokugawa shogunate didn't just trust these daimyo to behave. Many of them had fought against Ieyasu at Sekigahara.
They needed a way to control them.
So they instituted a dense, paranoid web of regulations. The most spectacular and effective of these was the Senkan Kotai system, or alternate attendance.
This is a fascinating policy.
All daimyo, regardless of how far away their domain was, were required to spend alternate years residing in the shogunal capital of Edo and their home domains. And when they went home to govern their provinces, they had to leave their wives and heirs in Edo as permanent, highly pampered hostages.
It's an absolutely brilliant mechanism of political control. It kept the daimyo constantly moving, constantly under surveillance, and crucially, constantly spending their wealth on travel and maintaining lavish estates in Edo, rather than stockpiling weapons or plotting rebellion back home.
They bled them dry financially.
Exactly. And they paired this physical control with a strict, frozen social hierarchy borrowed from Neo-Confucianism. Society was rigidly divided into 4 occupational classes.
Samurai at the top,
Followed by peasants, then artisans, and finally merchants at the absolute bottom.
and to ensure the system wasn't contaminated by outside influences, they enforced a controlled aperture to the outside world, often referred to as sakoku.
They heavily regulated foreign contact.
They eradicated Christianity, viewing it as a subversive foreign ideology that demanded loyalty to a distant pope over the shogun, and banned Japanese people from leaving the country on pain of death.
The Dutch were the only Westerners allowed to trade, and they were confined to one tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor, Teshima.
Precisely because they were interested in profit, not proselytizing.
Right. The explicit intention of the Tokugawa system was to freeze society in place. They wanted a perfectly static, agrarian, predictable world. But here we see the emergence of our next great structural recurrence, the massive, undeniable gap between formal social ordering and lived social reality.
The gap between the rules and reality.
Yes. Because the Senkan Kotai system, designed solely for political subjugation, accidentally created one of the most dynamic commercial revolutions in the pre-modern world.
Wait, let's look at the logistics of this. You have 300 lords, each traveling with massive retinues, sometimes thousands of samurai, servants, and porters, moving back and forth across the country every single year.
It's a massive logistical undertaking.
You suddenly need an entire nationwide infrastructure just to support this movement. You need maintained highways like the famous Tokaido Road. You need post station towns, inns, stables, ferry crossings, and massive food supply chains.
The infrastructure demands were staggering. And consider the financial mechanics. The lords are collecting their taxes back in their home domains in the form of rice.
But when the lord travels to Edo, he can't pay for his massive retinue's lodging and food with wagons full of rice.
Exactly. So the system necessitates a massive cash economy. The domains had to ship their tax rice to major commercial hubs, primarily Osaka, where specialized rice brokers would sell it on the open market.
They even invented early futures contracts, right?
Yeah, they did, converting the rice stipends into credit and cash. Without meaning to, the Tokugawa shogunate created an integrated, highly dynamic national market. Edo went from a quiet fishing village to a bustling metropolis of over 1 million people in just a century.
And this commercial explosion completely mocked and upended the formal social order they had tried to freeze. In the strict Confucian hierarchy, the merchants, the chonin, were at the very bottom.
They were officially despised.
Because they theoretically produced nothing. They merely moved goods around and profited off the labor of the peasants and the artisans. But in reality, the merchants were the ones accumulating all the cash. They controlled the flow of goods, the credit markets, the rice exchanges.
Meanwhile, the samurai at the top of the hierarchy were trapped. They were forbidden from engaging in commerce or farming. They were paid in fixed rice stipends by their lords.
But as the economy monetized and the merchants drove up the standard of living, those fixed rice stipends kept losing value against inflation.
So the proud samurai, the highest class, were falling into massive, inescapable debt to the very merchants who were officially beneath contempt.
The lived reality was completely divorced from the formal order. And what the merchants did with all that concentrated wealth is incredible because they were at the bottom of the social ladder. They had no political power, so they poured their money into culture.
They funded this vibrant, hedonistic, commercially sophisticated urban culture known as the floating world, or ukiyo.
The ukiyo culture is a perfect reflection of this societal paradox. It was a world of pleasure quarters, tea houses, and theaters that existed parallel to the rigid strictures of samurai life. This is the era that birthed the kabuki theater.
Now, kabuki wasn't some quiet, refined performance for the aristocracy.
Oh, no, it was loud, dramatic, hyper-commercial entertainment for the urban masses. They had elaborate trapdoors, revolving stages, actors walking right through the audience on raised wooden platforms called hanamichi.
You also have the incredibly sophisticated puppet theater, bunraku, where the great playwright Chikamatsu Manzemon is writing deeply psychological, devastating tragedies.
And his plays almost always focus on the collision between Gary's social duty or obligation and ninja raw human feeling.
It's a theme that resonated profoundly with an urban population living in this incredibly rigid, suffocating society.
And of course, you have the visual explosion of the woodblock prints, the ukiyo-e by masters like Hokusai and Hiroshige.
These weren't unique commissioned paintings for lords. They were mass-produced, highly affordable, vividly colored prints sold to an increasingly literate and wealthy urban public.
It was a cultural renaissance funded by the lowest class, while the highest class functioned essentially as indebted, obsolete civilian bureaucrats longing for a martial past that no longer existed.
But the intellectual developments of the Tokugawa era are just as important, if not more so, than the artistic ones. And this ties directly back to our theme of borrowed form and native essence.
How so?
Well, the Tokugawa shogunate relied heavily on Neo-Confucianism, a philosophy borrowed from China, to legitimize their rule. Neo-Confucianism provided a deeply rational, ordered view of the universe, and it stressed the acquisition of objective moral knowledge through a practice called the investigation of things.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you institutionalize a philosophy that tells generations of bright scholars to meticulously investigate things, eventually they're going to turn those investigative tools on the very foundations of your political system.
Enter the Kokugaku.
Or national studies scholars, particularly a brilliant, meticulous thinker named Moturi Norinaga in the late 18th century.
Norinaga and his peers took the rigorous philological and analytical methods developed by Neo-Confucianism, and instead of applying them to Chinese texts, they applied them to Japan's most ancient indigenous writings.
Texts like the Kojiki, the Record of Ancient Matters, and the Tale of Genji.
They spent decades decoding the archaic pre-Chinese linguistic layers of these texts.
And what Norinaga argued after all this research was nothing short of explosive. He claimed that over the centuries, Japan's true, authentic identity had been buried under suffocating layers of imported Chinese scholasticism, Buddhist metaphysics, and rigid Confucian moralism.
He argued that Japan's native essence wasn't based on abstract, rational, moral principles at all.
It was based on pure, spontaneous emotion, an acute aesthetic sensitivity, that mono-no-aware concept again, and fundamentally, on the sacred familial relationship between the Japanese people and the divine emperor.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the immense political implications of that argument. The Tokugawa shogun was justifying his absolute rule using Chinese Confucian philosophy while keeping the divine Japanese emperor effectively under house arrest in Kyoto.
Norinaga's philological research was inadvertently providing the exact intellectual vocabulary and historical justification needed to argue that the shogun was an illegitimate usurper of the emperor's divine ancient authority.
The Kokugaku scholars, armed with ancient poetry and grammar, were laying the intellectual dynamite to blow up the entire Tokugawa system.
So by the mid-19th century, the Tokugawa system was structurally exhausted. It was a powder keg of staggering samurai debt, peasant unrest due to famines, a completely fictionalized social hierarchy, and this brewing, deeply nationalistic intellectual movement centered around the emperor.
The regime tried multiple times during the Kyoho, Kansei, and Tempo reforms to suppress the commercial economy, forgive samurai debts, and force everyone back to simple agrarian frugality.
But you simply cannot uninvent a national market economy. All this highly pressurized, fragile system needed was a spark from the outside.
Which brings us to the second massive epoch of selective reception, Meiji survival and the imperial reinvention.
The year is 1853.
That spark arrives in the form of American Commodore Matthew Perry, steaming into Edo Bay with a squadron of black, ironclad, steam-powered warships.
The Tokugawa shogunate, for all its strict surveillance and control, takes one look at these massive shelf-firing guns and realizes the terrifying truth: they are completely, hopelessly defenseless.
The shogunate capitulates. They sign unequal treaties, opening ports to American and European trade, effectively proving to the entire country that the Bikufu, the military government, can no longer perform its single most important duty.
Protecting Japan from foreign intrusion?
Exactly. This is a devastating, fatal blow to a regime whose entire legitimacy is based on enforcing absolute order and keeping foreign influence at bay. It proves to be the catalyst for the system's rapid collapse.
But what's crucial to understand is that the Tokugawa order did not end through foreign conquest. It ended through a swift internal transformation.
Young, lower-ranking samurai from powerful outer domains like Satsuma and Choshu, who had harbored historical grudges against the Tokugawa for centuries, used the young emperor, Emperor Meiji, as a rallying banner.
Operating under the slogan, Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, they overthrow the shogunate in 1868 in what's known as the Meiji Restoration.
And here we have to map the distinct motivation behind this second great epoch of reception. During the Heian period, the motivation for cutting off China and turning inward was internal cultural consolidation.
But the motivation for the Meiji era was pure, unadulterated, existential survival. The new Meiji leaders looked across the water at China, saw how the mighty Qing Empire had been utterly humiliated, addicted to opium, and carved up into spheres of influence by Western powers.
And they realized, if we don't modernize our entire civilization immediately, we are next.
They quickly dropped the expel the barbarians part of their slogan and adopted a new one fukoku kyuhei rich country, strong army.
To achieve that, they launched one of the most remarkable, deliberate, top-down transformations of a civilization in human history. Within just 40 years, they dismantled the feudal structures that had defined Japan for centuries.
They officially abolished the samurai class, stripping them of their stipends and their right to carry swords. They dissolved the ancient domains and replaced them with a centralized prefectural system.
They established a conscript national army, created a universal education system, and industrialized at an absolutely breakneck pace, building telegraph lines, railroads, and massive textile mills.
And they achieved all of this through a massive, highly calculated wave of foreign borrowing.
It's astonishing.
I mentioned earlier that it was like downloading an OS, but for the Meiji leaders, it was like going on a global shopping spree for a government. They literally sent a massive delegation, the Iwakura mission, from 1871 to 1873 to tour the United States and Europe.
We're talking about half the new government's leadership, plus scholars and students spending years meticulously studying Western shipyards, parliaments, schools, and factories.
They looked at everyone's systems and ruthlessly picked the best parts. We'll take the Prussian military organization and their conservative constitutional model, thanks. We'll use French frameworks for our criminal law. We'll build a British-style navy. We'll borrow American centralized banking and educational models.
It is the ultimate manifestation of selective cultural reception.
But what's truly fascinating here is how they managed this unprecedented influx of foreign scaffolding without totally fracturing their national identity or suffering a catastrophic social collapse.
And they achieved this by masterfully employing our first structural recurrence, the dual structure of authority.
Ah, right.
The Meiji oligarchs, men like Ito Hirobumi and Yamagata Aritomo, who were actually running the government and making all the difficult disruptive decisions, held the practical power. But they aggressively centralized all the sacred legitimacy in the figure of the young Emperor Meiji.
They took this rigid, imported Prussian constitutional framework and they deliberately wrapped it in the native essence. They formally separated native Shinto from Buddhism, which had been deeply intertwined for centuries, and they elevated state Shinto to a mandatory national cult.
They took the exact vocabulary of imperial divinity and pure Japanese spirit that Motoori Norinaga and the Kokugaku scholars had developed in the Tokugawa era, and they weaponized it to legitimize this massive, disruptive modernization project.
It was a brilliantly constructed, invented tradition. They used the ancient mythic language of the sun goddess to command the population to accept telegraph wires, steam trains, and heavy taxation.
You really have to pause and consider the sheer psychological whiplash this caused for the Japanese populace. Imagine being a samurai.
Right.
For generations, your entire identity, your spiritual ethos, your status at the very top of the social hierarchy has been defined by your hereditary right to carry two swords. Overnight, the government tells you you're obsolete, confiscates your swords, and gives you a rapidly depreciating government bond.
It led to violent pushback, most notably the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, which the new conscript army crushed. Or imagine being a peasant, suddenly conscripted into a national army wearing a Western-style uniform. Or heavily taxed to fund modern factories where the labor conditions were frequently brutal.
It was an incredibly brutal, jarring transition. But structurally, it worked. They successfully used the West's own technological and institutional tools to avoid being colonized by the West.
By industrializing, building a modern military, and eventually defeating the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, they proved to the world they had achieved great power status.
But of course, this incredible balancing act, tying rapid Western-style industrialization to a potent ideology of ancient, divine imperial supremacy, eventually proved deeply unstable.
The military expansion that began as a desperate survival strategy took on a life of its own, spiraling out of the civilian government's control and culminating in the catastrophic devastation of the Pacific War.
Which leads us directly into the third major epic of selective reception, post-war democratic reconstruction. The utter devastation of World War II, ending with the firebombing of major cities and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, produced an extreme traumatic rupture in Japanese history.
In 1945, the country was occupied by Allied forces, primarily the American military led by General Douglas MacArthur. The occupation authorities imposed a completely new constitutional order. They drafted a parliamentary democracy, famously included Article 9, which renounced the sovereign right to wage war, and implemented massive land reform and labor laws.
Now, if the motivation for the Meiji epoch was existential survival against imperialism, the distinct motivation for this post-war epoch was rapid economic catch-up and national reconstruction from the ashes.
And the text makes a brilliant analytical move here by directly comparing these two eras. The structural patterns we saw in the Meiji period are glaringly visible in the post-war era. Both were massive, state-directed transformations, heavily utilizing foreign institutional scaffolding.
The parallels are striking. During the Meiji era, they borrowed Prussian constitutionalism and European industrial models to survive the threat of Western imperialism. In the post-war era, they borrowed American democratic frameworks and scientific management practices to survive absolute economic ruin and rebuild their nation.
But, and this is the crux of the native essence argument, just as Meiji society didn't magically turn into a carbon copy of Prussia, post-war Japan did not turn into a replica of America.
The native cultural texture remained fiercely intact beneath the imported institutions. They absorbed American forms but retained and even strengthened deep, culturally specific social structures.
We see this clearly in the economic realm. They adopted American concepts of quality control and corporate efficiency, but they merged them with Japanese social expectations, creating systems like lifetime employment and seniority-based promotion.
Instead of raw, American-style free market capitalism, they utilized incredibly close collaborative coordination between government bureaucracies, like the famous Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MIT, and massive corporate conglomerates called keiretsu.
This was a direct, modernized echo of the state-led development strategies pioneered during the Meiji era. Japan meticulously studied American management, adapted it to their own social rhythms, and then used it to build an export-driven economic juggernaut that fiercely competed with, and in some sectors surpassed, American industry itself.
And look at how perfectly the dual structure of authority maps onto the post-war era. The American occupation authorities completely stripped Emperor Hirohito of all political and military power, forcing him to publicly renounce his divine status.
But they intentionally kept him on the throne as a symbol of the state to ensure social continuity and prevent a communist uprising. The sacred, symbolic center remained intact.
Meanwhile, the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, emerged as the bureaucratic, practical governing institution holding the real political power, dominating elections for decades. It's the emperor in the Fujiwara clan or the emperor in the Tokugawa shogun, playing out all over again in a modern democratic context.
It really is a profound testament to the resilience of this civilizational model. To completely swap out your political and economic operating system twice in a single century, from feudalism to an industrialized imperial state, and then from a ruined empire to a pacifist democratic economic superpower, and yet still remain fundamentally recognizably yourself, is an astounding historical achievement.
Think about the magnitude of that. How many societies could survive that kind of repeated systemic whiplash without completely shattering?
It brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the concept that makes all of this adaptation possible, the aesthetic of impermanence. This is the fourth major structural recurrence in Japanese civilization, and it beautifully ties everything we've talked about together.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this aesthetic of impermanence is not merely a poetic or philosophical posture adopted by bored aristocrats. It is born from a harsh, undeniable environmental reality.
To geography again.
Exactly. The Japanese archipelago is a land of relentless seismic and meteorological violence. It is the land of devastating typhoons, frequent earthquakes, tsunamis, and active volcanic eruptions. In a landscape that constantly shakes, floods, and destroys what you build, you simply cannot base your civilizational identity on the premise of physical permanence.
If you build a massive stone monument, it is just heavy rubble waiting for the next major earthquake.
So, a civilization formed under those precarious conditions rationally concludes that true beauty and deep truth are found not in eternity, but in transience. The text gives such gorgeous, evocative examples of this.
Like the cherry blossoms, the sakura. They are the ultimate symbol of Japan, not simply because they are visually pretty, but precisely because they fall and scatter after only a few days of blooming. Their profound beauty is entirely dependent on their fleeting, fragile nature.
We see it in the haiku poetic form, which doesn't try to make a grand, timeless, epic statement like a Western sonnet, but rather attempts to capture a single, vivid, fleeting moment of perception in just 17 syllables.
We see it deeply embedded in the wabi-sabi aesthetic, heavily influenced by Zen Buddhism, and most clearly expressed in the tea ceremony. It's an aesthetic that finds deep, melancholic beauty in the irregular, the weathered, the rustic, and the incomplete.
It is a profound aesthetic acknowledgement of time's inevitable erosion of all physical things. But perhaps the ultimate, most powerful metaphor provided in the text for this mindset is the Eye's Shrine.
The Eye Shrine is fascinating. It's one of Japan's most ancient and sacred Shinto sites, dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu. But unlike the Parthenon or the pyramids, which attempt to defy time through sheer stone mass, the wooden complex at Eyes is ritually dismantled and entirely rebuilt, using freshly harvested cypress wood every 20 years.
They build an identical structure on an adjacent alternating plot of land. They have been doing this for over 1,000 years.
It achieves absolute permanence, not through the endurance of its physical materials, but through a dedicated commitment to perpetual intentional renewal. The form survives because the material is allowed to die and be replaced.
And that concept is the ultimate synthesis of our deep dive today. The aesthetic of impermanence isn't just about art or architecture. It is the fundamental key to understanding Japan's entire political and cultural history. It is the underlying psychological mindset that allows Japan to discard a centuries-old shogunate, adopt a rigid Prussian constitution to survive the 19th century, and then later adopt an American democratic framework to survive the 20th century without ever feeling like they have lost their civilizational soul.
They inherently understand that the outer forms, the governments, the legal codes, the military structures, the corporate models, are temporary. They are necessary scaffolding for a specific era.
They are allowed to fall away and scatter like cherry blossoms when the season changes, as long as the native essence, the invisible, deeply rooted cultural kernel, remains intact and continually renewed.
Japan's deepest continuity, ironically, is its habit of reception and conversion. They take the foreign in, they digest it, they let the old forms die, and they produce something entirely distinct. And this brings it all back to you, the listener. Why does a deep dive into the structural recurrences of Japanese history matter to you today?
It matters because we are all currently living in a world defined by constant, dizzying disruption. Technological, social, and economic shifts are happening faster than ever before. Entire industries are being made obsolete overnight.
Exactly. And Japan's civilizational model offers an absolute masterclass in profound resilience. It demonstrates on a massive historical scale that you do not have to rigidly, stubbornly defend your old ways or your outdated operating systems to maintain your core identity in the face of overwhelming change.
True stability doesn't mean standing still like a stone monument waiting for an earthquake. You can boldly adopt the best tools, the best frameworks of the current era, digest them, adapt them to your own core values, and let the obsolete forms fall away without fear.
True. Lasting stability might just look like perpetual, intentional renewal.
That is a powerful and highly practical takeaway. And it leaves us with one final provocative thought to consider, building directly on the historical patterns we've discussed today. We've mapped the three great historical waves of selective reception: The Heian absorption of Tang China, the Meiji absorption of 19th century European industrialism, and the post-war absorption of mid-century American democratic capitalism.
Yes, so what's the next wave?
Exactly. Today, with the explosive, disruptive rise of the digital age, artificial intelligence, and a borderless global internet, we are undeniably witnessing the dawn of a fourth great wave of cultural reception.
Oh, absolutely. If Japan's historic genius is taking foreign code, whether that's Chinese writing, Prussian law, or American corporate management, and rewriting it to protect and enhance its native essence, how will they process this new era?
How will the aesthetic of impermanence and that ancient, resilient dual structure of authority manifest in a fully digital, post-geographical world where the borders aren't defined by treacherous seas and typhoons, but by algorithms, artificial intelligence, and data streams?
It is an incredibly fascinating question to mull over as we watch the next chapter of this civilization unfold. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Until next time, keep exploring.